Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled, and Mirz Hashem. Today, we will hopefully be learning Daf Reish Tes Zayin Amud Aleph. That is the Dirshu page for today. We'll have to see how far we can get. We pick up today on Reish Tes Vav Amud Beis with a new Siman, Siman Shin Samach Aleph, Din Gag Hasamach L'Rishos Harabim, the halachas that pertain to an interesting case. A case where there is a gag, there's a roof of a house that is abutting the Rishus Harabim. Uboy Beis Seifim, and here we have two Seifim. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, HaNesunim Batsaru Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bei Bayam Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachem Alehem, V'Yitziah Mitzaru L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'Oira Mishibud L'Geula, Hashta B'Agolo of Zman Kariv and Amar Mein. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Moiri V'Rabi Reb Shalom Ruvain ben Shima, for Achi Agadol Moshe Meir ben Esther Fradl, for Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka bas Shira Leah, Chavadasa bas Rezel Serel, Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, and for Gila Shifra bas Yilan Udal. They should all have Refuah Shalema b'Soich Shar Chayla Yisrael. So we have a fascinating share today, replete with toys and models for audiovisual presentation. I think it's kedai, before we even see the mechaber, to explain and describe the case that we're going to be dealing with. I think once we do that, it will be very easy for everybody to follow exactly what's going on. So the case is as follows, and this happens, I remember seeing this, I haven't been there in a long time, hopefully I'll be there soon, but I remember seeing this quite often in Eretz Yisrael. You have a house that is built into a hillside, so that the grade of the property is much higher on one side than it is on the other side. So I want you to imagine a house that is built into the hillside. On the elevated side, on the hillside, there's a Rishus Harabim. On the lower elevation, where the hill slopes down, on the other side of the house, to the, I don't know if it's the back or the front, whatever it is, but adjoining the house, there's a chutzner. And now we have a situation where if you measure from the ground level on three sides of the house, the house is at least 10 tefachim tall. But on the fourth side, the side where the Rishus Harabim is, if you measure from the ground level of Rishus Harabim to the roof of the house, you don't have 10 tefachim. Let's say you have 9 tefachim. And I made you a little model over here because I think it will be very helpful if people could actually visualize what it is that we're talking about. So let's see. My face is going to go out of the screen for a moment, but the all-important toys will be in the screen. So this over here, Rabbi Isai, is your house. Now, behind the house, there's a chutzner. See where this ladder, with this gentleman on the ladder is? He's the owner of the house. He is located inside the chutzner. The ground level of the chutzner is down here. If you measure from the ground level of the chutzner up to the roof, this house is 10 tefachim tall. If you measure from here, on this side of the house, from the ground level, the house is 10 tefachim tall. Trust me, you can't see it, but if you measure from this side of the house back here, the house is 10 tefachim tall. But this fellow over here is standing in Rishus Harabim. This Rabbi Isai is the Rishus Harabim. If you measure from the ground level of Rishus Harabim to the top of the roof, you don't have 10 tefachim. Now, let's do the math here for a second, if we can. When you have a house, right, this gag, this is a platform. If you're coming from the perspective of the Rishus Harabim here, this is a platform in Rishus Harabim. Now, when you have a platform in Rishus Harabim, we have to decide, is the top of the platform mukaf mechitzos or not? Is it mukaf mechitzos of 10 tefachim tall or not? Well, let's take a look. Again, over on this side back here, this is 10 tefachim tall. So this wall over here, good asik, halacha l'moshe misinai, we extend this wall up, and guess what? On that side, the gag is going to be considered to be mukaf mechitzos, 10 tefachim tall, right? Just trying to make this a little bit more visually comfortable by making this somewhat level, but not to be. Okay, doesn't matter. That's just my perfectionism. Okay, so on this side, 10 tefachim tall. Good asik bechitzais. Over here, you have a bechitza 10 tefachim tall. Back on this side, it's 10 tefachim tall. Good asik bechitzais. We extend this wall up. This side is mukaf bechitzas 10 tefachim. Over on this side, go down to the ground level of the chutzner. You have a height of 10 tefachim. So good asik bechitzais. This side of the gag is mukaf bechitzas 10 tefachim tall. So here, and here, we have bechitzas that are 10 tefachim tall. But over here, we have to measure from the ground level of the Rishus HaRabim. Here, we don't have 10 tefachim. Turns out that this gag is mukaf bechitzais on 3 sides. On 3 sides, it has good asik bechitzais of 10 tefachim. Well, according to the vast majority of Rishonim, once you have an area that's mukaf bechitzais on 3 sides, this gag is a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa. Okay, it's a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa, but we have an interesting problem. This fellow here who's standing in Rishus HaRabim, it's very, very easy for him to take off his hat that he's wearing and put it down on top of this roof. You can see he's standing over here, and he's head and shoulders taller than the roof. Now, he's in a Rishus HaRabim. If he takes off his hat in the Rishus HaRabim and he puts it on this roof, he was just over Nissa Daraisa. He made an Akira in Rishus HaRabim. He made a Hanacha in Rishus HaYachid. Really, the owner of this house, it would be incumbent upon him to put up a big sign over here in the Rishus HaRabim. Beware, this is a Rishus HaYachid. Don't take anything off from here on Shabbos and put it down here. Don't take off your hat from here and put it over here on Shabbos. Is it Daraisa, Chiv Katas? You're transferring from a Rishus HaRabim out to a Rishus HaYachid. That's one issue. That's not the issue that we're going to be dealing with. The issue that we're going to be dealing with is that Chazal see a conflict. Or the way I like to put it is, they see tension over here between the Rishus HaRabim and the Rishus HaYachid. What do I mean? Well, we just did the math, and we said that this gag is a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa. Now, for the owner of the house to use this gag, what he has to do is, he has to go to his garage, he has to get the ladder, he has to climb up a ladder, and then he could access his roof. So, while this gag is a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa, in order for the owner, in order for the balabayas of the house to use it from his property, his access to the roof from Rishus HaYachid, this chutzner behind the house, is mukaf bechitzais on daled stadim. This is completely a Rishus HaYachid, right? For him to access his roof from his Rishus HaYachid, he needs to go get a ladder and needs to climb up, and then he could use the roof. The fellow in Rishus HaRabim who's just walking by, for him to access the roof, he just has to walk by, take off his hat, and put it on. So the access to the roof is actually easier for the B'nai Rishus HaRabim than it is for the Balabayas in the Rishus HaYachid. Now you'll tell me the owner of the house, he could also come out of the chutzner, he can go around the street to Rishus HaRabim, he could access his house from the Rishus HaRabim. That's true. But then again, that means that he's accessing the roof from the Rishus HaRabim. So the tension that exists over here is, for who is it easier to access the roof? Is it easier for the B'nai Rishus HaRabim, or is it easier for the Balabayas in the Rishus HaYachid? The answer is, it's easier for the B'nai Rishus HaRabim. Therefore, Chazal came along, and Chazal said, we have to make a gzeira. We cannot just consider this roof a Rishus HaYachid. Now, obviously, l'chumra, we have to consider it a Rishus HaYachid, because it is a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa, right? But, mid-Daraisa, there's a chumra and a kula. The chumra is, for this fellow here in Rishus HaRabim, if he takes off his hat and puts it here, he's over in Issa Daraisa. The kula is that because it's a Rishus HaYachid, the owner of the house is allowed to go up here, he's allowed to move things around as much as he wants, Dalet Amas, 20 Amas, whatever it is. This is completely a Rishus HaYachid. That's the kula angle of this being a Rishus HaYachid. Chazal said, we have to treat this l'chumra. What does that mean, l'chumra? Chazal said, even for the owner of the house, he's not allowed to be mishtamish on top of this gag. He can't be metaltal yosim midalad amas on top of this gag. We're going to I'm sorry, I just misspoke. He is allowed to be metaltal yosim midalad amas on the gag. What he's not allowed to do, the mechaber is going to say, is he's not allowed to transfer anything from the rishus hayachid, from the chotzer, up until the gag. So again, even though this gag is a rishus hayachid daraisa, the owner of the house is not allowed to transfer from the rishus hayachid here in the chotzer up to the gag. We're going to treat the gag like a karmelis in that way. We're going to restrict him from transferring either from the gag down to the rishus hayachid below, or from the rishus hayachid below up to the gag on top. If there's something on the gag, the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, he could move it around. Very interesting. We're not treating it like a karmelis completely. He's allowed to be metaltal on top of the gag if there's something on the gag. But to transfer from the rishus hayachid below up to the gag, or from the gag down to the rishus hayachid, that he's not allowed to do, is a d'Rabbanan. Why? Because this gag is very easily accessible to the rishus harabim. If we're going to allow him to transfer from the rishus hayachid to the top of the gag, a mistake might creep in. Somebody might think you could somebody might look at this and think it's really rishus harabim. I mean, look how accessible it is from the rishus harabim. We can't have that, so it's an issa d'Rabbanan. But there's a way to remedy the situation. What's the way to remedy the situation? This right here. The way to remedy the situation is for the owner of the house to put up a gag kavua, a sulam kavua. He has to put up a permanent ladder. What does that mean, a permanent ladder? He has to put up a ladder, and he has to leave it there during the week and Shabbos. He has to put up a permanent ladder. How does that help? Once there's a permanent ladder, now we consider that it's just as easy for the owner of the rishus hayachid to access the roof as it is for the fellow in rishus harabim. Now we're evening the playing field between the bnei rishus harabim that are elevated on this side and the balabayas who's down below on this side. We ease the tension between the rishus harabim and the rishus hayachid, and we return this to the din daraisa of being a rishus hayachid. Okay, now, against that backdrop, I think we could start the mechaber over here, and the mechaber is going to be relatively easy. The complications are going to creep in when we dive into the Mishnah Berurah, says the mechaber. Sef Aleph. Gag hasamuch l'rishus harabim. So you have this roof, right? You have this roof that is samuch l'rishus harabim. It's abutting the rishus harabim right over here next to it. And it's besoich asar tvachim. And from the rishus harabim perspective, the roof is besoich asar tvachim. Over here, you don't have a height of more than 10 tvachim. Over here, the height is less than 10 tvachim. So again, gag asamach l'rishus harabim, a rooftop that's right next to the rishus harabim, it abuts the rishus harabim, and it's besoich asar tvachim, and its height is lower than asar tvachim when measured from the level of the rishus harabim. Ulamayla me'asara l'chotzer. But when you measure from the chotzer back here, this wall is lamayla me'asara. So you measure from that side of the house, it's lamayla me'asara. Okay, what the mechaber leaves out is that on the other two sides, it's also lamayla me'asara. And because of that, the gag is mukaf mechitzais on three sides, because on three sides we have a height of asara tvachim, and we could say good asik. So the top of the roof is mukaf mechitzais on three sides, and it is a rishus hayachid daraisa. And by the way, even though, interestingly enough, the Chavetz Chaim chose not to make that point clearly, but the Aruch HaShulchan makes the point very clearly. The Aruch HaShulchan says straight out, this rooftop is undoubtedly a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa. And the truth is, when we read between the lines of the Mishnah Berurah, we'll also understand that it's very clear that this is a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa. Really, from the Mechaber, it's going to become very clear that it's a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa. So, Gaga Samach Rishus HaRabim Sechasar Tvachim L'mayla Me'asar L'chotzer. Hayil v'Rabim Mishtamshim Boi, since the B'nai Rishus HaRabim can very easily use this gag. I mean, look at this guy. He's head and shoulders above the gag. All he has to do is take off his cute little baseball cap and put it down. Hayil v'Rabim Mishtamshim Boi, since the Rabbim can use this rooftop, Harei Zeh Ki Rishus HaRabim. This is similar to Rishus HaRabim. In what way is it similar to Rishus HaRabim? Well, it's a platform adjoining the Rishus HaRabim. It's less than 10 tefachim tall. 10 tefachim tall, Rishus HaYachid. But this is less than 10 tefachim tall. And it's Rabbim Mishtamshin Alav, which another way to say that would be Rabbim Mikatfim Alav, from Siman Shin Mem Hey. The Rabbim could use it, let's say, to adjust their packages. They're carrying a load on their shoulder. They could come over here and they could rest their load on top of the roof. Remember, we had a machlokes in Shin Mem Hey. The Mechaber said, if it's 9 tefachim and Rabbim Mikatfim Alav, it's a Rishus HaRabim. What if it's 9 and a tefach? So we had a machlokes. We're going over here like the Shitas that say that 9 and up, if Rabbim Mikatfim Alav, it's Rishus HaRabim. Well, again, this cannot be a Rishus HaRabim, halachically. It's mukaf bechitzais on 3 sides. It's a Rishus HaYachid. But if it's 9 tefachim tall, and anywhere from 9 to 10, and it's Rabbim Mishtamshim Alav, Harei Zeh Ki Rishus HaRabim. It's very similar to a Rishus HaRabim, says the Mechaber. Therefore, v'asel Baal Hagag lehistamish by meichatzeroi, the Baal Hagag, gentleman over here, the owner of the house, he's not allowed to use the gag meichatzeroi. He's not allowed to transfer from his chotzer. His chotzer is a bona fide Rishus HaYachid. He's not allowed to transfer from his Rishus HaYachid to the gag, because the chotzer is a bona fide Rishus HaYachid. This is Ki Rishus HaRabim. Also, l'Baal Hagag l'ishtamish by mechatzeroi ad sheyasaloi sulam kavua mechatzeroi, unless he makes a permanent ladder from his chotzer. Ezeu sulam kavua. What makes a permanent ladder? Kol shekavoi sham bein l'chayil bein l'shabbos. Any ladder that you set up over there and you leave it there both during the week and on Shabbos. Now let's dive into the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Aleph, Pesach Asar Tvachim, Dahainu, Shalitzad Rishus HaRabim, from the perspective of Rishus HaRabim, Eina Gavoya Asar Tvachim. You don't have a height of 10 Tvachim from the grade of Rishus HaRabim. On that side, it's less than 10 Tvachim tall. Ulitzad HaChotzer, but on the other side of the house, we have the Chotzer, who Gavoya Asar Tvachim. On that side of the house, it is 10 Tvachim tall. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if it wasn't 10 tefachim tall, even on the chotzer side, in other words, if the grade on this side of the house, on the chotzer side, would be equal to the grade on the Rishus HaRabim, and when I say equal, I'm not being bedafka, that it has to be equal, but if it's not 10 tefachim tall on this side, and it's not 10 tefachim tall on this side, well then, even if it's 10 tefachim tall on this side and on this side, it would only be mukaf bechitzais on 2 sides. So says the Mishnah Berurah, if it's not 10 tefachim tall on the Rishus HaRabim side or on the chotzer side, lo yaya mahani sulam klal. What would a sulam do? A sulam would not allow the owner of the house to be metaltal from his chotzer to the rooftop to have your Rishus HaRabim gomor, kisharabim mekatfim alav. Again, if you don't have good asik mechitzais on 3 sides of this rooftop, right? So then let's do the math. Here you have a Rishus HaRabim. This is a platform that's very easily accessible from the Rishus HaRabim. Rabim mekatfim alav. It's a height that they can use to rest their packages on, right? It's not mukaf bechitzais on 3 sides. It's not mukaf bechitzais on this side. It's not mukaf bechitzais on this side. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, this is going to be a bona fide Rishus Harabim. The Mishnah Berurah is taking the position it wouldn't even be a Carmelis. It would just be like an extension of the Rishus Harabim because it's adjoining the Rishus Harabim. It's accessible from the Rishus Harabim. It's Rabbim Mekatvim Alav. The Rabbim in the Rishus Harabim is using it, so it's becoming bottled to the Rishus Harabim. It's true that it has a chotzer on this side, but even on the chotzer side, it's not 10 tefachim tall. So the Mishnah Berurah takes the position that in that case, this would be a Rishus Harabim Gomor. Now, if this is a Rishus Harabim Gomor, then there's no way that the Bala Chotzer could take something from the Chotzer, which is a Rishus HaYachid, and put it up on the Rishus Harabim. That would be innocent daraisa. That's what the Mishnah Berurah is saying. The ilu loy haya gavaya asar tvachim afal tzad Chotzer loy haya mahani sulam klal. Then what's a sulam going to do? It's a Rishus Harabim. You can't turn it into a Rishus HaYachid by putting up a sulam. The heavy Rishus Harabim Gomer kisharabim mekatvim alav ukishein mekatvim alav. Now, if you'll tell me, what if from the Rishus Harabim side it's not 9 tefachim tall? Let's say it's 6 tefachim tall from the Rishus Harabim side. Then it's not Rabbim mekatvim alav. The Rabbim is not going to use it. In that case, it's not really bottled to the Rishus Harabim. Heavy I'll call upon him Carmelis. So then it's a Carmelis. It's a platform adjoining the Rishus Harabim that's between 3 and 9 tefachim. So since it's over 3 tefachim, it's not bottled to the ground level of the Rishus Harabim. Since it's less than 10 tefachim, it's not a Rishus HaYachid. It's not Mukav Mechitzai, so it's not a Rishus HaYachid. And it's lower than 9, so it's not Rabbim Mekatvim Alav. So it's not bottled to the Rishus Harabim. So then what is it? It's a Carmelis. And if it's Carmelis, again, you're not allowed to be mishtamish from the Chotzer, which is the Rishus HaYachid, to the Carmelis, right? You wouldn't be allowed to use it from the Rishus Harabim either, because it would be from Rishus Harabim to a Carmelis. Aval hashta, but now in the Mechaber's case, kevan de mitzad Chotzer hu gavoya asar tvachim, but in the Mechaber's case, it is 10 tvachim tall from the Chotzer. It's also 10 tvachim tall on the other two sides. It's only on the Rishus Harabim side that it's not 10 tefachim. Yesh ala gag teres Rishus HaYachid. So really the gag is a Rishus HaYachid. Umuta lehishtamish alav kishiyesh lo sulam kavua la lo yispay b'chatzera legagoy. So then, as long as the owner of the house puts up a sulam kavua, he could transfer between the Rishus HaYachid and the gag. But without a sulam kavua, he cannot. Why? Din derabanan. Because since the Bnei Rishus Harabim have better access to the roof than the owner of the house does from the Rishus HaYachid, the rooftop is getting drawn midarabanan to the Rishus Harabim to the extent that we don't let the owner be mishtamish from the chotzer to the rooftop. But if he puts up a sulam kavua, he can, says the Mishnah Berurah weiter. Why? By establishing a sulam kavua, the owner now successfully draws the gag to him in the tension between the Bnei Rishus Harabim and the owner of the Rishus HaYachid. Once there's a sulam kavua, the owner of the Rishus HaYachid wins. But without the sulam kavua, the Bnei Rishus Harabim have easier access than the owner in the Rishus HaYachid. The access from the Rishus Harabim is easier than the access from the Rishus HaYachid. And therefore, in that tension, Chazal saw a problem, and they said then we would not allow the owner of the Rishus HaYachid to transfer from the chotzer to the rooftop. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to start tweaking the case a little bit and doing the math and figuring out what the halakha should be when we make these tweaks. And it's a little complex, says the Mishnah Berurah. Vim mitzad Rishus Harabim gavoya asar tvachim. We'll go mikala like kaved. First, let's make an easy change. Let's say that we don't have this crazy case. The Rishus Harabim is not elevated more than the Rishus HaYachid side. Okay. V'im mitzad Rishus Harabim gavoya asar tvachim. If you have a height of Asar Tvachim even on the Rishus HaRabim side, ain't Tzarech Sulam. Then you don't need a ladder. Why should you need a ladder? If you have a height of 10 Tvachim on all sides, so what? So the house fronts onto the Rishus HaRabim. So what? The Gag is Mukaf Bechitzais on all four sides. So it's total Rishus HaYachid. The owner of the house doesn't need a Sulam. What does he need a Sulam for? It's obviously Rishus HaYachid. Okay. V'ima Gag nomuch pachos me'asar Tvachim mikol tzad. Oh, now this is going to get fascinating. Let's say the house doesn't have a height, an exterior height of Asar Tvachim on any side. So when you walk around this house is like a bunker. This house is 9 Tvachim tall. That's how tall this house is, on all four sides. And in the back, there's a chotzer. Okay, very nice. But you don't have an exterior height of 10 Tvachim, not on any side. But, ubesoichai, inside the house, amayk asar Tvachim. So you approach this house, and this stairs, going downstairs to get into the front door of the house, right? You go downstairs, and there's the door, and you go inside. When you go inside, you got an 8-foot ceiling. And you've got high windows, like on top, like basement windows. So imagine that this is a basement. I actually know of a building like this, where somebody built a building for a shul, and they didn't have enough money. They didn't have money to build. So you know what they did? They did the excavation for the foundation. They poured the foundation, and they didn't have money. So they put a roof over the foundation. And they made steps going down, and the shul is the basement. But there's only a basement. There was no first floor. They just made a roof on top of the foundation. So the whole shul is underground, right? Now, in that case, it happens to be that the building does extend more than 10 Tvachim above the ground. But you could easily see a case where it would not. So you have this building that is, the majority of it is underground. On any side of the building, you don't have an exterior height of 10 Tvachim. But interior, you have an 8-foot ceiling. So in the interior, you definitely do have a height of 10 Tvachim. So let's do the math. Inside the house, it's definitely Rishus HaYachid, right? But what's the din of the Gag? Well, do you have good asik mechitzais that are surrounding the Gag? No. Because good asik mechitzais, you got to measure from the outside of the walls. You don't have 10 Tvachim on the outside of the walls. So you don't have good asik mechitzais to surround the roof, right? So what would make the roof a Rishus HaYachid? The answer is that the way to make the roof a Rishus HaYachid, l'chayra, is that since the interior is a Rishus HaYachid, we know that the avir of Rishus HaYachid is Elad l'Rakia. So, okay, so since inside is the Rishus HaYachid, the Rishus HaYachid could penetrate through the roof going up, and you would say that the roof is also a Rishus HaYachid. That would be a theory. Says the Mishnah Berurah. What do you do in mitzad Rishus HaRabim gavaya asar tvachim? Oh, I'm sorry, I lost the place. If you don't have an exterior height of 10 Tvachim on any side, but inside it's 10 Tvachim deep, for example, right? They did the excavation of the foundation, and they made a depth of Asar Tvachim. Das HaMagen Avram de'ein tzarech sulam. Then the Magen Avram says the owner of the house does not need a sulam kavua in order to be allowed to go up from his chotzer up onto the roof and transfer it to the roof. De'ein shem karmelis alav, because we're not going to call the roof a karmelis. Dehu Rishus HaYachid Gomor. Magen Avram takes the position that that roof is a Rishus HaYachid Gomor. Now, Rabbi said this is one of those things where I could read the Magen Avram and I could just go weiter. But I'm sure some of you are thinking right now that this Magen Avram is a huge problem. And let's just do the math, and you'll see right away why it's a huge problem. We started off this Siman with this case. You've got less than 10 Tvachim on this side, you've got more than 10 Tvachim on all the other three sides. And we said, whoa, there's a din d'Rabbanan. There's a din d'Rabbanan that this guy needs a sulam kavua to transfer from his Rishus HaYachid in the chotzer up until the roof. Why? I mean, this gag is a Rishus HaYachid daraisa. Yeah, but you know what? It's accessible from the Rishos HaRabim. There's a conflict between the Rishos HaRabim and the Rishos HaYachid. Chazal were afraid. This is Kir Rishos HaRabim. It's like a Rishos HaRabim. How could we let him transfer from the Rishos HaYachid to this Gag, which is like a Rishos HaRabim? He can't do it unless he has a Sulam Kavua. That's how he started off the Siman. Now we're tweaking the case, and we're imagining that the grade level on this side is the same as the grade level on this side, and indeed, it's the same grade level on all four sides. Comes the Magen Avram, you don't need a Sulam in that case. This is a regular old Rishos HaYachid. You don't need a Sulam. What do you need a Sulam for? I don't understand. Did we just make the case better or worse than what we started with? When we started the Siman and we had this case, we have a case where you have a height of 10 Tvachim on three sides. I mean, this is a bona fide Rishos HaYachid, as good as you can get, almost. It's Mukav Mechitzis on three sides. And we said, despite that, you need a Sulam Kavua. Now the Mishnah Berurah is tweaking the case, and he's saying, it's not 10 Tvachim on any side. I mean, doesn't that make it worse? So it's not 10 Tvachim on any side. Says the Magen Avram, if it's not 10 Tvachim on any side, bona fide Rishos HaYachid, you don't need a Sulam. Huh? I don't understand. We just made this case more Chamor or more Kal. Superficially, I would think that we just made the case more Chamor. Again, Rabbi Isai, in the beginning of the Siman, you have a bias that's 10 Tvachim height externally on three sides. So the Gag, forget the fact that there's a Rishos HaYachid inside, right? But it's even Mukav Mechitzes on three sides. To allow the Balabayas to be mishtamish from the Chaser to the Gag, you need a Sulam Kavua. Now, we're making the case worse. What do I mean we're making it worse? We're making the Rishos HaYachid status weaker. Why? Because it's a Rishos HaYachid inside, but now we took away all of the external Mechitzes. Because now you don't have a height of 10 Tvachim on any side. So l'chayr, we just made the case worse. Comes the Magen Avram and says, in that case, the Issa D'Rabbanan for the beginning of the Siman doesn't apply. Why? Because it's a Rishos HaYachid inside. What, in the beginning of the Siman, it wasn't a Rishos HaYachid inside? In the beginning of the Siman, assumedly inside the house, there was a height of 10 Tvachim. So, where's this Magen Avram coming from? So you should know, first of all, that if you look at the Sha'ar Tzion, and if you look in the Aruch HaShulchan, the Aruch HaShulchan doesn't even pay lip service to this Magen Avram. The Aruch HaShulchan brings down the Machzah Shekel. He says, Toyas HaTfus. It's a textual error. The Magen Avram never said it. And that's the approach of the Aruch HaShulchan. It's not his. He's taken it from the Machzah Shekel. Mishnah Berurah brings it down in the Sha'ar Tzion as well. But Rabbi Yisai, there is a pshat. There is a pshat. I'll tell you what the pshat is. The pshat is that you have to remember, we're talking about a din d'Rabbanan here. And the way I explained the din d'Rabbanan to you is that the underpinning of the Issa d'Rabbanan in the beginning of the Siman is the tension and the conflict that exists between the B'nai Rishos HaRabim and the owner in the Rishos HaYachid. This is undoubtedly a Rishos HaYachid midaraisa. But the access from the Rishos HaRabim is easier than the access from the Rishos HaYachid. And therefore, it's somewhat drawn. It's Kir Rishos HaRabim. And that's why we slap a restriction on him. And we tell him he can't transfer from the Chatzar to the Gag without a Sulam Kavua. But now let's look at the Magen Avram's case. In the Magen Avram's case, the roof is also undoubtedly a Rishos HaYachid. Why? Not because of good Asik Mechitzas, but because the interior is a Rishos HaYachid. And the Magen Avram holds that if the interior is a Rishos HaYachid, then the Gag is a Rishos HaYachid. But now there's no tension between the Rishos HaRabim and the Rishos HaYachid. You know why? Because it's the same height on all four sides. And therefore, in that case, the B'nai Rishos HaRabim do not have an edge over the owner of the Rishos HaYachid. In this case, his access is easier than his access. But if the grade is the same on all four sides, Nobody has easier access than anybody else. Well, that takes away the conflict. It takes away the tension. Once you take away the conflict, the owner of the Rishus HaYachid wins. It is a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa, and there's no conflict where the B'nai Rishus HaRabim have an edge to pull it away. So then we don't say that it's Kir Rishus HaRabim, and the owner of the Rishus HaYachid needs a Sulam. That is how I, Lanias Daiti, again, I'm spal that I'm right, that is how I learned Pshat in this Mishnah Berurah. Okay. So that's the Magen Avram. So that's the Magen Avram. Dein tzarch sulam, dein shem kamaslav klal, do Rishus HaYachid gomer. But the Mishnah Berurah says, "V'rabim me'achrayim cholkin alav." Many achrayim disagree with this Magen Avram. V'daitam, and their opinion is the midrabanan shem karmelos al gabay milamala. They hold that in that case also, where you don't have a height of 10 tefachim on any side, the top is going to be considered a karmelos. Came into namach me'asar tefachim, we called sad. Since it's less than 10 tefachim on all four sides, so the Chazal are going to treat it like a karmelos. V'tzarch sulam la'atirai, u'befrat kisharabim mekatfen olav, efshir duhu rishus harab gomor al yedei zeh, va'afilu sulam lo'imahani la'atirai. There's a Prima Godim that takes it all the way to the other extent. The Prima Godim says that if it's less than 10 tefachim on all four sides, and one side abuts the Rishus HaRabim, and the Rabbim is mekatfim alav, the Rabbim uses it, it's a Rishus HaRabim. It becomes bottled to the Rishus HaRabim. Fascinating. And they disagree with the sheet of the Magen Avram that since the interior is a Rishus HaYachid is Oila Adler Rakia. Why? Because there's a roof intervening. Since there's a roof intervening, they don't say it's Oila Adler Rakia. Okay. Obviously, Rabbi Yisai, there's a lot more to this. We do what we can do. I'm trying to give it to you as best as I can without getting. We're not learning Masechtas Erev and Be'iyun, right? It's a Mishnah Berurah here. So I'm trying to give you a pshat, an understanding to go through it. I hope I have been successful. Let's go weiter over here. Mishnah Berurah is cutting bays. Mishtamshin boy, the Rabbim makes use of this gag. Shamanichim kayvam v'kelim tanam ala gag. This fellow over here, he's going to take off his baseball cap when he's walking in the Rishus HaRabim, and he can put it on the gag. It's a daraisa, chiv chatas. Is cutting dalid. The din derabanan is that the owner of the Rishus HaYachid is not allowed to be mishtamish with the roof meichatzeroi. He's not allowed to transfer from his chatzer to his rooftop. Ava bagag mutal atalta bekulai. That's where I misspoke earlier in this year, and I said that he's not allowed to be metaltal miyosa dalanamas on the roof. That's not true. He is allowed to be metaltal miyosa dalanamas on the roof. It's very interesting. We're treating it like a Rishus HaYachid because it's a Rishus HaYachid daraisa. He's allowed to be metaltal dalanamas on top of this roof. But to transfer from the Rishus HaYachid to the rooftop, that he can't do midrabanan unless there's a sulam kavua. Ice cotton hay, what makes a sulam kavua? Kol shekava isham, as long as he put the ladder there permanently, hainu sha'imid sham sulam tamid, the ladder always stays there. But if he sometimes takes the ladder away to use it for another purpose, hareyu kaman delesa, then it would be as if the ladder is not there, and then the ladder would not help for this halacha. Okay? Very, very complicated sif. So now let's turn to sif beis. Bottom line on Reish Tesvav Amid Beis. Let's see how quickly we could move through at least a decent part of Reish Tezayin Amid Aleph, says the Mechaber. Chatzer shenifritza b'milua. If you have a chatzer that is adjoining the Rishus HaRabim, so you have a chatzer, it's mukaf bechitzais on all four sides. One of the sides is right alongside the Rishus HaRabim. So one bechitza of the chatzer abuts the Rishus HaRabim, and now the wall came down where it hits the Rishus HaRabim. Maybe a car jumped the curb and took the wall out. Chatzer shenifritza b'milua, oi b'yeser me'yeser l'Rishus HaRabim. Or maybe the car didn't take out the complete wall adjoining the Rishus HaRabim. Maybe what happened is the car took out a section of the wall, but the section of the wall that the car took out is wider than 10 amas. Now, right away, when we start to do the math on this case, we had a chotzer, which was mukaf dalud mechitzais. It's a Rishus HaYachid. A car came, took out the wall or at least took out a section of the wall larger than 10 amas. Well, that's going to void that mechitza. So now what do we have? We have a chotzer that's mukaf gimel mechitzos. Midaraisa, this chotzer is still a rishos hayachid. But if it's nifratz b'milua l'rishos harabim, it's completely breached to the rishos harabim. Either it's completely breached because the entire wall came down, or it's completely breached because even if the entire wall didn't come down, the section that came down is wider than 10 amas. It's no longer a pesach, it's a breach. So now this chotzer is nifratz b'milua l'makam aser. So we know what happens. Now the inside of that chotzer, even though midaraisa it's a rishos hayachid, now it's going to become a karmelis. Now you're not going to be allowed to be metaltal yosim midalad amas inside that chotzer. But now the question that the mechaber is going to deal with is not the inside of the chotzer, but the space that had been occupied by the wall. So let's imagine that you had the side walls of the chotzer, and what I'm going to call the front wall of the chotzer, the wall of the chotzer that was alongside the rishos harabim, was not inset in between the two side walls. It was in front of the two side walls. Now that that wall is completely gone, there is a space alongside the rishos harabim that used to be occupied by that wall. What is the halacha of that space? Now that space is interesting. That space is not mukaf mechitzos at all. On one side is the rishos harabim. On the other side is the interior of the chotzer. On the two short sides, it's also blank. There's nothing there. What is the status of the makam of the mechitza? Says the mechaber, Mekayim ha-mechitza nidoin kitzidei rishos harabim. We're going to call the place that had been occupied by the wall tzidei rishos harabim, the sides of rishos harabim. Now, we've come up against tzidei rishos harabim previously. When we spoke about tzidei rishos harabim, I think it was in Shin Mem Hey, when we spoke about tzidei rishos harabim, we spoke about an area along the side of rishos harabim where there were amudim, pillars. We spoke about shopkeepers who would have pillars that they hung their wares from. That area where the pillars are is not a mokum hiluch harabim. People can't really walk there, right? Because these amudim are obstructions in the pathway. So it's not a mokum hiluch harabim. So therefore, the tzidei rishos harabim is not rishos harabim. The tzidei rishos harabim is a karmelis. The mechaber is saying over here that the place that had been occupied by the wall has a din of tzidei rishos harabim, because also it was not a mokum hiluch harabim. Now, technically, now that the wall is not there, technically maybe it really could be absorbed by the rishos harabim, but the assumption is that it will not be, and it has a din of tzidei rishos harabim, and therefore says the mechaber on the top of Reish Tezayin Amud Aleph, shehu karmelis. So this area that the space that the wall had been in now is a karmelis, kimoi shehu hachotzer, and the chotzer is also a karmelis. So again, let's just recap this halacha. You had a chotzer, and it fronted onto the rishos harabim. The wall of the chotzer that fronted onto the rishos harabim is now gone. Either it's gone in its entirety, or even if there are parts of it remaining on the two sides, if the breach is more than 10 amas wide, that's considered that side of the chotzer is completely breached. The chotzer is now nifratz b'milua. It's completely breached to a makom aser. It's completely breached to rishos harabim. The interior of the chotzer is now a karmelis. You're not allowed to be metaltal more than daled amas inside that chotzer, even though midaraisa it's a rishos hayachid. You're certainly not allowed to go from the chotzer to the rishos harabim. I mean, transfer. You're allowed to walk, but you can't transfer from the interior of the chotzer to the rishos harabim, or from the rishos harabim to the interior of the chotzer. That would be haitzah midaraisa, right? But you're also not allowed to be metaltal yosim midaled amas inside the chotzer. The area where the wall was is also now a karmelis. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah over here, which begins on the bottom of Reish Tes Vav Amud Beis. Mishnah Berurah is cut vav. Mekayim ha-mechitza nidoin kitzidei rishos harabim. The space that had been occupied by the wall now has a din of tzidei rishos harabim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, tzidei rishos harabim ba'alma nikra kishem ha'amidim avodim gedolos. The tzidei rishos harabim was a place where sometimes they would put up large stones, or they would put beams sticks into the ground, samach lekaisel, next to the wall that's on the side of the Rosh Hashanah, shelo yaziku karainos, so that when wagons go down the Rosh Hashanah, they don't bump into the walls and damage the walls. You see this nowadays sometimes also. Sometimes alongside the Rosh Hashanah, between the Rosh Hashanah and a property that abuts the Rosh Hashanah, they'll put large boulders. Sometimes nowadays they put up those huge flower pots for security purposes, but again, it is to create an obstruction between the Rosh Hashanah and the wall or the property alongside it. The airspace that's between these stones or these yesedos, technically it's part of the Rosh Hashanah, but it's nikrat tzidei Rosh Hashanah, the dinoi kekarmelis, and that area has a din of a karmelis. Now, you're not allowed to transfer from that area to the Rosh Hashanah proper, because that would be going from a Carmelist to the Rosh Hashanah. The Kamash Malon, and the Mechaber is teaching us here, Da'af be'inyanenu, in our case, where a car took out the wall going into the Chatzar, after lekashum hefsik ben Chatzar l'Rosh Hashanah, even though now there is no obstruction left because the wall is gone, va'ayli bei rabim lehedya v'darsile, and therefore it is very easy for the rabbim in the Rosh Hashanah to walk in that space that had been occupied by the wall. Afilo hachi, still and all, ein dinoi rakitzidei Rosh Hashanah. It doesn't become annexed by the Rosh Hashanah. It's treated like tzidei Rosh Hashanah. V'shem karmelis alei va'asel taltal mimakom zelachutz. You're not allowed to transfer from that space that had been occupied by the wall outside to the Rosh Hashanah, because that's going from a Carmelist to a Rosh Hashanah. You also can't go from the Rosh Hashanah to that space, because that's going from a Rosh Hashanah to a Carmelist. V'em Carmelist samach lechatzar, if this Carmelist is next to the Chatzar, which it is, mutter, to be Carmelist leCarmelist kamataltal. So from the area that had been occupied by the wall into the Chatzar, you're allowed to go. That's Carmelist to Carmelist. This is the Chavetz Chaim L'Shitasai, who holds that our streets, we should be machmer and we should consider them a Rosh Hashanah. We generally paskin not that way. Ois Cotton Zion, the Mechaber said that the area that had been occupied by the wall is Tzidei Rosh Hashanah. It's a Carmelist. Kemoi shehu haChatzar. And so is the interior of the Chatzar. The interior of the Chatzar is now also a Carmelist. Return to Larmar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, Kemoi shehaChatzar gufa shem Carmelist aleha. The interior of the Chatzar itself is now considered a Carmelist. Machmashu paritz beruach revius. Because its fourth side that abuts the Rosh Hashanah is now completely breached to the Rosh Hashanah. So now the whole interior of the Chatzar is a Carmelist. Kain hu gam kain mekayim ha-mechitza. So too, the place that had been occupied by the mechitza is also a Carmelist. V'nimtzinu l'meidid milosha zeh shnei dvarim. We could learn from this two things. Echad, the Chatzar zeh osel l'taltel kiyem b'seich arba amis. First of all, now that the Mechaber is telling us Kemoi shehu haChatzar, now that the Mechaber is telling me that the interior of the Chatzar is now treated like a Carmelist because it's completely breached to the Rosh Hashanah, you're not allowed to be metaltal yosim midal amis in the interior of the Chatzar. Shenis, din number 2, demimokam ha-mechitza l'seich ha-Chatzar mutter l'taltal b'seich arba amis. You would be allowed to transfer something from the space that had been occupied by the wall into the interior of the Chatzar, as long as you're not moving it more than Dalet Amos, right? Because the Tarvayu Shem Carmelis Allah, because the interior of the Chatzar is a Carmelis, the space that had been occupied by the wall is a Carmelis. From a Carmelis to a Carmelis, you're allowed to transfer. The only thing is, you can't go Yosim Dalet Amos. So if you had a crazy wall over here, if this wall was monstrously thick, so that this wall was more than Dalet Amos thick, and you have a chayfetz all the way on the Rosh Hashanah side of the space that had been occupied by the wall, and you want to carry it from there into the interior of the Chatzar, and that's going to be a distance of more than Dalet Amos, which is not happening, right? But that would be also because then you're moving something Dalet Amos inside a Carmelist. Let's go weiter. Says the Mechaber weiter near the end of the line, top line, Reish Tezayin Amud Aleph. V'im nifratz bekeren zavis. A keren zavis, Rabbi Yisai, is a corner. So the halakha that we've been dealing with until now is that you had a chatzar, right? This is the chatzar. These are the four walls of the Chatzar. Along here is the Rishus HaRabim. So here's the Rishus HaRabim. We were talking about a case where this wall, the wall that abuts the Rishus HaRabim, was either taken out completely or it was breached with a breach wider than 10 amas. But what if that's not what happened? What if this was a corner property, so that you have a Rishus HaRabim here and you have a Rishus HaRabim here, and a car came and took out the corner? So it took out a section of this wall and of this wall. It took out a corner. And now you have a diagonal opening from the Rishus HaRabim into the Chatzar. Says the Mechaber, V'im nifratz b'keren zavis, if a corner of the Mechitza was breached, then afilu b'pachas me'eser aser. Then the breach is going to make the Chatzar nifratz b'miluai to the Rishus HaRabim, even if the breach is less than 10 amas wide. Now, why is that? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, and this is a very important yesod that we need to remember as we go through Chelik Daled. V'im nifratz b'keren zavis ritzayin l'loymar, what the Mechaber wants to say is as follows: Sha'apirtza achla b'shtei haksalim shel hachatzar b'soifan zeh eitzel zeh. The breach is at the end of two walls. The breach is at the end of this wall. It's also at the end of this wall, so that it busted open a corner of the Chatzar. And now, even if that breach is in its entirety less than 10 amas wide, it's still considered a complete breach. Why is that? The reason is because why do we say that a breach that's narrower than 10 amas is not a breach? Because we call it a Pesach. We call it a doorway. But, at least in the times of the Mishnah, the Gemara, it was not customary to make doorways in a corner. The truth is, from an engineering perspective, you're compromising the structure on two sides. You're compromising the load-bearing capacity of two walls of the binyan. So generally speaking, they did not make doorways in the corner. Therefore, even if the breach is less than 10 amas wide, I don't have the option of calling it a Pesach. So if it's a breach, it's a breach. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's got ches. Return a limud shapritz achla b'shtek sal b'shalachasa b'seifin zeh etzel zeh. Mashba b'gemara, the Gemara implies dem apirtza nasa b'shar mekaymis shalak salim. Let's say you have a breach in one wall of the mechitza, not at the corner, in the middle, but you also have a breach on a second wall of the mechitza, somewhere in the middle. Afilu hayu b'shtei salim, you have on two walls. As long as each breach is less than 10 amas, shari, it's still mutter. So if you have an 8 amma breach in the east wall, and you also have an 8 amma breach in the south wall, right? So neither wall is compromised. Each wall has a doorway in it, because it's less than 10 amas. And the Gemara's mash, but that's okay. Vayin Chamba Taisus, but take a look at Taisus who limits this. He says the dafka, that's only true if you want to call two breaches in two walls doorways, you could only do that if on each side you still have oimid meruba ala parts. The breached area has to be less than the standing area of wall on each side. But if you don't have oimid meruba ala parts, so if on the east side you have an 8 amma breach, and on the east side you're only left with 2 amas of the wall that remains standing, so you had a 10 amma wall. Now there's an 8 amma breach, and there's 1 amma of wall standing on one side of the breach, 1 amma of the wall standing on the other side of the breach. So on the east, it's parutz meruba ala oimid. You have more breach than you have standing wall. Now it's still less than 10 amas, right? So doorway. But now on the south side, which was also 10 amas, you also have an 8 amma breach and only 2 amas of standing. In that case, Taisa says, no good. Now the bechitzas are bottle. The chaykas of Rashba ba'avodas hakodesh. The pachus be'eser, if the breach is in the corner, even if it's less than 10 amas, it's a breach. Explains the Mishnah Berurah what I spoke out. When there's a breach in a corner, we cannot call it a doorway. The pischa b'keren zavis layav the inchi, because people did not make doorways in corners. We only say this in the case of a breach. what if there was a breach taka in the corner, but then you made a tzuras HaPesach, literally the form of a door? What's a tzuras HaPesach? We're all familiar with the tzuras HaPesach of Eruv fame. You put up a lechi on one side of the breach, a lechi on the other side of the breach, and a string or a beam on top of the two lechis, so you made the form of a doorway. Now it is called a Pesach. Certainly if you actually went and built a whole door frame, so then yeah, you made a doorway in the corner. In other words, the Mishnah Berurah is saying like this: we can't use the lumdus of a Pesach. If we have a breach that's wider than 10 amas in a corner, we can't go ahead and call it a doorway. Why? Because people don't make doorways in corners. But if you go ahead and you make a tzuras HaPesach over there, well, then you did make a doorway. Certainly, if you actually build a doorway into the corner, well, it is a doorway. It's only the lumdus of calling it a Pesach that we can't do. If you actually convert it to a Pesach, it's a Pesach. Oiskan Yud, Aser, since people don't make a Pesach in a corner, if you have a breach in the corner, even if it's less than 10 amas, it's going to void the mechitzas, and now this chatzar is going to be considered nifratz b'miluai to the Rishus HaRabim l'makam aser. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Mistabra, it makes sense to say, dem haya pirtza pachus me'ama, right? If you just read the Mechaber, well, it sounds like if you have a breach in a corner and it's less than 10 amas, it's nifratz b'miluai. Okay, how about if you have a breach and it's 2 inches wide? So it's nifratz b'miluai, says the Mishnah Berurah. If the breach is less than an amma, ain't lachmir. We're not going to be machmir and say, oh, it's a breach. It's different. The Rashba is very, very machmir over here. He says once you have a 3 tefach or a 4 tefach breach, you would have to put up a lechi on each side of the breach. If it's 4 tefachim or more, ain't lo hechsher. You can't fix this breach until you make it less than 4 tvachim. Weiter in the Mechaber says the Mechaber, once we're on the topic of breaches in a corner of a binyan, says the Mechaber, second line, middle of the line, v'chein bias shenifratz b'keren zavis. Right now we were talking about a chotzer, a courtyard, where a car hit the corner and took out the end of 2 walls to make a breach in the corner. Says the Mechaber, a house. You actually have a structure. A car went into the structure and breached the corner of the house. Even if that breach is less than 10 amas, and the roof was also taken out, until you have a situation where you only have a diagonal of the roof. So what does this mean? Very, very simple. This is your bias. Okay, this is the corner of the bias. This is the roof of the bias. A car came this way, took out the corner, right? It took out the corner of the house. So it took out the corner, and not only did it take out the 2 walls, but it also took out a section of the roof. And now that the car did all of this damage, what do you have? You have a breach in the wall here. You have a breach in the wall here. You also have a breach in the roof. It took out the roof too. And the edge of the roof now that's remaining is on a diagonal. It's ba'alachsain. The edge of the roof is on a diagonal. So again, v'chein bayish shenifratz b'keren zavis. You have a house that became breached in the corner. Afilu b'pachas me'eser. Even if that breach is less than 10 amas wide. V'nifratz gama kerui. And the roof was also taken out, and now the edge of the remaining roof is on a diagonal. Aser, carrying inside the house is going to be aser, because the house is no longer considered mukaf mechitzos. It's considered nifratz bimiluai to the outside. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois cotton yadal, v'chein bias, koloimar. You might be tempted to say that in this case that I just described, right, the ruler is the remaining roof. The edge of the ruler is the edge of the remaining roof. You might be tempted to say that by a bias, you're right that this wall is gone, this wall is gone, and since it's in a Keren Zavis, we can't call the opening a Pesach, and therefore the house is breached. But you might think that a house has an edge over a chutzner. A chutzner doesn't have a roof. A house has a roof. Why does that matter? Because now you have this remaining edge of the roof, and we should apply the halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai of pi tikra yored v'saisim. We should say that using halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai, we take this edge of the roof, extend it downward, and say that it walls off the open corner of the house. Kamash Balan, that we can't say that. And you know why we can't say that? Because pi tikra yored v'saisim, at least according to a lot of Rishonim, actually doesn't make a wall, it makes a Pesach, a doorway. And over here it can't make a doorway because it's in a corner. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says now. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the loyte mashani by staff b'tein lahat makmas Pesach they should be carrying zavas b'kamak b'ikam b'sham pitikra shal gabi yored v'saisim. Don't think that by a bias, because it has a roof, you could close off the corner using pitikra yored v'saisim. Kamash balad de pa'amim lekam misham pitikra mefarish hechidami. Sometimes we can't say pitikra, and then the Mechaber explains, "I cut yud beis acha nishar ba'alach soin aser." In this case, where the remaining edge of the roof is at an angle, it cuts across the corner. You can't say pitikra de bazeh enakiri shaveh, because now that the edge is not straight, it's a corner, it's an angle. Loyam reading pitikra yored v'saisim. We cannot say pitikra yored v'saisim. Let's go a little bit weiter. Third line down. Alva pritza she'ena b'keren zavis. But if the breach in the wall of the house is not on a corner, let's say a wall of the house became breached, just, it looks funny, it came breached just on a side wall. You have a breach. And let's say the breach is even wider than 10 amas, but the roof is still intact and it's a straight roof, then you could say pitikra yored v'saisim to close it off. Even if the breach is wider than 10 amas, we could still say pitikra yored v'saisim. Somebody's going to ask, if pitikra yored v'saisim makes a Pesach and it's wider than 10 amas, it can't be a Pesach. Maybe we'll get to there. Okay. V'hu shaloye pitikra meshupa deleka peh. But, and we've come up against this before, that's only if the roof of the house is flat. If the roof of the house is pitched, we can't say pitikra yored v'saisim from the edge of a pitched roof. Says the Mishnah Berurah, even if one entire wall of the house was taken out, but you still have the roof, you could say pitikra yored v'saisim. Shalei nishar gifufin klal. There aren't even short walls left over at the two sides. The complete wall was taken out. The Mechaber does not address the question over here. Could you say pitikra yored v'saisim on two sides of a house? Are you limited in the application of pitikra? Could you say it even on two sides of a house? He didn't address that here. Because if you look at the Beis Yosef, you'll see that the Mechaber was not sure. The Mechaber didn't want to rule on it. But the Ramah is going to quote the Torah. The Sasam Kishitas Apaiskim Disfir Lud Afilu Parch Shteimechitzais Armin on Pitikra Yard V'Saisam Ukidal Kamei Aiskat Yadalid Shalom Meshupa. We can only use Pitikra on a flat roof, not on a pitched roof. It's saying the Loimar. The Loyam Yad Yard V'Saisam Rakish Atikra Chalak. We only say Pitikra Yard V'Saisam on a flat roof. Avaloikishu Meshupa, but not on a pitched roof. Kain Gagin Shalonu Shoim de B'Shipua Imloy Hoya Tikra Tachteha. Okay, I'm going to finish the Siman, Rabbi Isai. Haggah says the Ramah. There are those that say there are those that say that in order to use pitikra yored v'saisim, so let's go back to this case. This entire wall of the house, or even a breach, not the entire wall, but wider than 10 amas, it was breached, but you still have the roof. If you still have the roof, we could say pitikra yored v'saisim. But what if what happened is the wall was taken out? Maybe after the wall was taken out, the structure became weak, and the roof caved in. Except for a little section of roof where the ruler is, along the edge. So along the edge where the wall was, there's still a piece of roof going end to end. But behind it, the roof caved in. So do you really have a roof? No. But you have an edge. How thick does that remaining edge have to be in order to apply P Tikra Yared Decisive. Says the Mishnah Berurah Tesvav, Yodalid. No. Where did I go? Where did I go? Yeah. Ice Katan Tes Vav. V'yesh arbim. V'chein halacha k'moshe kasavti b'bir halacha. Oh, okay, Tes Zayin. I was in the Ramah. Okay, I'm sorry, I got confused. Let's go back to the Ramah. The remaining strip of roof has to be at least 4 tvachim deep. Sorry that I lost my place over there. This is what the Mishnah Berurah was alluding to, that the Ramah is machriya, that you could say Pi Tikr Yared V'Saisim even on 2 walls. As long as there are 2 adjoining walls. So let's say you have the east wall and the north wall, so they're adjoining each other. You could say, and they're both breached, you could say Pi Tikr Yared V'Saisim on both. But if they're opposing walls, but if your north wall and your south wall were breached, you can't say Pi Tikr Yared V'Saisim on 2 opposing walls. Let's finish off the Mishnah Berurah over here. It says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Tes Vav. V'yesh Oimrim v'chein halacha k'moshe kasavti b'bir halacha. The Mishnah Berurah says, indeed, this is the halacha that the strip of remaining roof has to be at least 4 tvachim deep. That's when you could apply pitikra. We're going to learn the halachas of a mavui. And a mavui is an alleyway that doesn't have a roof, and you need to put up a kaira, a beam, sometimes, at the opening of the alleyway to create a mechitza. That beam is not required to be 4 tvachim thick. It could be 1 tefach thick. The kairas mavi ein ela hakera ba'alma. By the kaira of a mavi, we're not really employing Pi Tikr Yared V'Saisim. It's only a hecker. Aber kol hechad b'ina mechitza az tzarich sheyeh b'dafka arba tvachim v'az b'ina Pi Tikr Yared V'Saisim. Az kan yedzayin im yesh kan shtei mechitza shleimos pirish v'mechitzas hanistarm nishar aleim kiroi shal nistar imayim. The Ramah said you could say Pi Tikra on 2 walls, as long as you have, I said that the breach is in 2 connecting walls. The Ramah means if you have 2 full walls that are still touching each other, so your east wall and your south wall are complete, and it's your west wall and north wall that are breached, you could say Pi Tikra. But if the breaches are in opposing walls, and the complete walls are also opposing, then you can't say Pi Tikra. Now, I'll just close with this. What's the lumdus of that? The lumdus is very simple, Rabbi say. If this wall is breached, and this wall is breached, you can't say Pi Tikra Yared V'Saisim, because you have an opening that's mufulish. You have an opening that goes clear through the house. You can't close that off with Pi Tikra Yared V'Saisim. Masha'en kain, if this wall is breached and this wall is breached, you could close them off with Pi Tikra, because it's not mafulish. It doesn't go all the way through. Okay, thank you for bearing with me for such a lengthy share. The beginning was complicated, the end not so much. Thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. So limud HaTorah should be making a ganz klais for the branch from to say Yeshua's first part after Shidduchim. To all those in need, we should be zeichen to see the best God tzedek. Amen. Be well.